alumni at the ANU. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to present on a topic that that complemented my Vice-Chancellor, and as we could see with some of the questions that occurred at the end, it follows on that we should have a conversation about globalisation. So this is a mall that most of you will recognise, and I wanted to start this presentation with a question, and that is, what is the condition of today's world that most defines our world? Many would have different answers to that. My answer to that is that the really defining condition of today's world is actually globalisation. Because globalisation really means that we are able to access the best of what the world is able to produce wherever we live in the world. If we are part of the globalised world, that is, all of us who don't live in North Korea, we are able to get the very best technology, the very best fashions, the very best TV shows. And what to me is really remarkable about today's world is that whoever we are, if we are moderately well off, if we are moderately well employed, the same technology that we use is the same technology that Donald Trump uses. So the truly remarkable thing about globalisation for me is that it is a remarkably democratising force. It gives everyone access to the best of what the world produces. It means that innovations are spread effortlessly and suddenly. As soon as we get the new version of the iPhone or the Samsung, immediately everyone gets access to it. This is a truly remarkable world in which we live. But is it a world that we should take for granted? Is this a condition that will always be with us? Can we be confident in the sorts of timeframes that the Vice-Chancellor was talking about? By mid-21st century, will we still be living in a globalised world? And I think the answer to that is less than obvious. I think that we tend to take things like globalisation for granted. As Joseph Nye once said, globalisation is sort of like oxygen. You don't notice it until you start to run out of it. And I worry that globalisation and some of the trends that we see could be starting to slow down. So to look at how and whether globalisation will continue to exist in the century ahead of us, I think we need to look back. We need to look back at 2 centuries of globalisation that have occurred, because I think you can see that in the way that economics and politics interacts, that there have been distinct ages of globalisation. And in particular, there has been an age of deglobalisation that I think we can learn from. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the different phases of globalisation that we've seen over the last 200 years. The first phase of globalisation went for about 100 years. There's been a lot of debate in the economics literature about when globalisation first appeared. I've taken a little bit of liberty with it, but most economic historians agree that globalisation appeared somewhere between 1815 and 1820. That was a time when they worked out that the prices of key commodities and goods in the United Kingdom were set by global movements in prices. And so what we saw in the century between 1815 and 1914 was what I would call the first age of globalisation. And the first age of globalisation was characterised by the enhanced movement across borders of goods, finance and people. But it was a remarkably one-sided movement of goods, finance and people, because it was underpinned essentially by two forces, one political and one technological. The political force was empires, European colonialism. Globalisation in its first stage was propelled at the point of a gun or a cannon or a warship as the Europeans colonised the rest of the world. And of course, the European colonisation of the rest of the world had remarkable effects on Europe, and it had remarkable effects on the rest of the world. Of course, the first part of the world that was colonised were the Americas. And Europe had a very good deal out of colonising the Americas, because Europe acquired access to a lot of different types of food. Potatoes in particular, maize and corn. And what that did was it allowed food consumption in Europe to grow remarkably quickly. And some of the population movements that the Vice-Chancellor was talking about from the 19th century onwards was because European society was much better fed over time through these imported foodstuffs. Europe gave back to the Americas diseases. And so while the European population went up, the Native American populations went down. And so the first stage of globalisation was remarkably unbalanced. The second force driving the first stage of globalisation was transport. Changes in particularly energy use. Firstly, the rise of steam transport, then the rise of fossil fuels, then finally the rise towards the end of the 19th century of electricity, provided for the remarkable growth of transport, allowing goods to be transshipped between Europe and the rest of the world. It also allowed the very large outflow of people from Europe to many of the other parts of the world. And you had the Americas, parts of Africa, parts of Oceania like Australia and New Zealand being populated by Europeans. So the flow of people was one way. The flow of goods was two ways. The flow of finance was very much from Europe to the rest of the world. What happened at this stage was very uneven development. The first age of globalisation made the Atlantic economies very rich as they industrialised, and they made the Asian economies very poor as they deindustrialised. At the start of the colonial era, the most effective producer of cloth in the world was India. India made the best quality, most efficient, cheapest cloth in the world. 50 years later, India was making no cloth at all. It was importing cloth that was made in Lancashire in the United Kingdom, and it was exporting cotton and indigo as raw materials. This happened in most other parts of Asia as well. What happened, and underpinning this, was that you had the movement of commodities and goods, you had the movement of people, but you didn't have the movement of knowledge. Knowledge remained in Europe, the know-how to create industry and all of the things that you needed around industry stayed in Europe. And so you had all of the wealth staying in Europe. The politics within Europe were very pro-globalisation. Everyone from the working class to the wealthy industrialists was getting better off, and everyone was a supporter of globalisation. But of course, globalisation's first age came to an end in 1914. And we went through a period of 30 years of deglobalisation. Deglobalisation was driven by two world wars, the First World War and the Second World War. was driven by the Great Depression, which separated the two world wars, driven particularly by the rise of protectionism in most industrialised countries, and the growth in spheres of influence or new empires. As in this picture, Imperial Japan constructed its own empire as a defensive measure against the empires of the British and the French and the Americans and the Dutch. And in Europe, of course, tragically, Nazi Germany constructed its own European empire. The phase of deglobalization was a catastrophe for humankind. It killed tens of millions of people through war, but also famines like the Bengal famine of 1942. It created the largest destruction of wealth we have seen in both the Atlantic and the Asian economies. Quite interestingly, through this turbulent decade, we had inventions that were to set up the second age of globalization, particularly around military technologies that translated into transport and communications technologies, and also innovations in governance. So during this time we had the first experiment with a truly global organisation, the League of Nations. It was a failure, but ultimately humanity learned from the failures of the League of Nations for what was to come after the Second World War. This was a period in which the politics, both in war and nationalism, were driven by resentment and fear and defensiveness. It gave rise to the second age of globalisation, starting at the end of the Second World War and going through to the end of the Cold War. Ultimately, the second age of globalisation was driven by a number of positive forces, both political again and technological. The first force was, of course, decolonisation, the sudden unravelling of European empires. The independence of countries like Indonesia and other countries throughout Asia and Africa gave rise to a remarkable surge in human creativity and human energy. Decolonisation was accompanied by another political force, a transformative political force, which I would call multilateralism. As the Second World War came to an end, the Allies met in San Francisco and Bretton Woods and came to an agreement on a number of global agreements and organisations, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and of course the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the International Monetary Fund. The thinking behind these agreements was that if left to their own devices, nations can make the wrong choices. And to set up a period of prosperity and peace after the Second World War and the Great Depression, humanity needed to come together and agree to a series of general understandings about how states would behave. So, a remarkable achievement in the United Nations was to give every state, however big or small, whatever race or creed, however new or old, an equal voting right in the United Nations, the peak body of decision-making in world affairs. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was even more remarkable because it brought about a series of multilateral commitments on behalf of countries about how they would trade with each other. Principles such as most favoured nation status, non-discrimination, and so on, locked countries into a series of agreements about allowing trade and investment to go about unhindered among them. And so you had a whole series of political agreements that were allied with remarkable technical advancements in transportations as well. I would argue that one of the most remarkable changes in the second age of globalisation was the rise of the container ship, allowing unprecedented amounts of goods to be shipped between countries in large amounts and extremely rapidly. And so the second age of globalisation in some ways was like the first one, but a lot fairer. It allowed the free movement, or the relatively free movement, of goods and finance across borders, but these were not empire borders anymore, these were national borders. But the movement of people was much more restricted, and as yet the movement of knowledge between countries was much more restricted. And what we saw was a remarkable growth in wealth, as fast as we saw in the first age of globalisation across societies. Societies generally got richer and richer, although the gap between the Atlantic economies and the Asian economies, with the exception of Japan and Korea, Taiwan and Singapore, remained relatively large. It was driven by the politics of everyone getting richer at the same time. It was driven by the politics, as the jargon goes in my own discipline, of absolute gains. As long as everyone is getting better, everyone cooperates in a system in which everyone is getting wealthier and peace continues. But then a third age of globalisation came upon us. And it came upon us at a remarkable period of time. Again, technology and politics intersected. In 1990, you had the end of the Cold War, and suddenly a whole bunch of economies that had previously been separated from the global economy, those of the communist bloc in particular, suddenly joined the world economy. For countries like China, of course, it occurred as early as the late 1970s, for Vietnam halfway through the 1980s, and then for the Warsaw Pact after the end of the Cold War. And remarkably, at that period of time in the 1990s, you had the rise of the information and communications technology revolution. And this was truly a revolution. And I love some of the figures and the statistics associated with how remarkable this revolution was. One of the figures I love to quote is that all of the information that was transmitted in the entire world in the year 1986, by the year 2006, that entire volume of information could be transmitted in 1/2000th of a second. It's remarkable. Between 1986 and 2007, you had world information storage capacity rise by 23% per annum. You had world telecommunications capacity rise by 28% per annum. And you had world computing power rise by 58% per annum. Year on year compound growth. This is a revolution that has been truly profound, and I believe we are only just starting to understand the implications of this revolution that have occurred for our world. The implications for globalisation have been even more profound. Because whereas in the first two periods of globalisation, it was driven by the movement of goods and people across borders, the third age of globalisation was driven by the unprecedented movement of knowledge across borders and technology across borders. And what has really occurred in the third age of globalisation is that it has brought the comparative advantage of the Atlantic economies, which is knowledge and know-how, both technological knowledge and management knowledge, together with the comparative advantage of the Asian economies, which is labour and labour power. And it has brought those together, and the really remarkable change has been in the coming together of knowledge and labour has been that gap between the Atlantic economies and the Asian economies has suddenly shrunk. As you can see from this chart, the emerging countries, particularly the most rapidly emerging countries in Asia, their share of world GDP is rapidly catching up to what used to be the G7 most advanced economies. And of course, as the conversation in the last session in the Q&A had started to unravel, this has had profound effects on the politics of globalisation. Of course, what has really driven this period of globalisation has been the rise of global value chains. Large multinational corporations such as Toyota and Apple and Samsung and others have started to distribute their manufacturing activities across countries depending on where they can find the lowest cost sites for smaller and smaller segments of their manufacturing chain. What this has meant is that competition in the global economy has gone from competition among sectors in the global economy to competition among occupations or smaller and smaller sectors of global value chains. It has meant, to put it in unjargonised language, low-skilled jobs from places like Detroit in the United States have relocated to places like Indonesia and Thailand and Bangladesh and so on and so forth. And so you have got the remarkable convergence between what used to be developed and developing economies. The levels of wealth are starting to equalise, and if these trends continue, then we will see a return to a situation that we have seen for most of human history, and that is that society's population and its share of global production are roughly correlated. This means that most of the growth in the economics of the 21st century will occur here in the populous societies of Asia. But while you have got a convergence between economies, between what were developed and developing economies, you have divergence within economies. And of course, one of the things that has occurred is that increasingly low-skilled jobs in developed economies have either been offshored or have been mechanised over time. And one of the things that we are starting to observe in developed economies is that the very low-skilled jobs have either disappeared or they've been aggregated and mechanised like this and then overseen by more high-skilled blue-collar workers who have the capacity to do a lot more with the use of machinery as well. And of course, all of this leads to Trump and Brexit and the politics of fear and anger about globalisation. And so where I'm bringing us to is a real question about whether globalisation as we know it can continue as we know it. We see here a very interesting chart from a very good book that I will recommend to all of you by Richard Baldwin called The Age of Convergence. And here we see plotted out the amount of growth in incomes for the percentile of global income distribution. And as you can see, people whose incomes have really grown have been workers in emerging economies, industrialising emerging economies, and very high-skilled knowledge workers in the developed world. The people who have really lost out in places like Detroit are those formerly low-skilled workers in the lower middle class and the working class in the United States and Europe. These are the people who voted for Donald Trump. These are the people who voted for Marine Le Pen in France. And so this is the politics that is happening within countries today. We are seeing the politics of this emerge in Australia with the emergence of a name that you will all be familiar with, Pauline Hanson. You remember Pauline Hanson? Well, she's back. She's kind of like a vampire that never dies in Australia. And you're seeing this increasingly occur, I think also sometimes in Indonesian politics as well. And you're seeing it occur in Chinese politics and in Thai politics and in Philippines politics. This is not something that is confined to the rich world, to the Western world. It is showing up time and time again. And that's all very well until it starts to have an effect on the politics of globalisation. So each age of globalisation that we've seen has been driven by a consensus within societies. Because globalisation, when it's working properly in its first two ages, drove a particular type of politics. It drove the empowerment and the enrichment of people who benefited from globalisation. Those people became politically powerful, they funded political parties who advocated further globalisation, and you had a virtuous cycle within societies. What worries me about this politics is that we're starting to see the opposite cycle start to develop. So instead of the politics of hope, the politics of absolute gains, the politics of all boats rising, I think we're starting to see within national politics and in international politics, the politics of envy starting to develop. It's the politics that doesn't care whether I am getting better off in the current situation. What worries me is that you are getting better off faster than I am getting better off. This is the toxic politics that sits at the base of the Trump revolution. It's the toxic politics that sits at the base of the Brexit vote. There were people in exit polls after the Brexit vote who voted for the Brexit, who when they said, we realise that overall it's good for Britain to be in the European Union. But I really want Britain out of the European Union because I hate those rich bankers in London because they're doing really well and I'm only doing okay. So that is the sort of politics of envy. And I think we're starting to see in the anemic performance of world trade in goods and services and world investment flows, the start of the beginnings of this politics of envy, the rise of a new protectionist politics around the world. It's a negative cycle because we're starting to see trade agreements pulled out of, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because it's believed by countries that it will benefit their competitors more than it will benefit them. And so trade agreements are decreasing in quality, they're decreasing in ambition, and we're seeing the rise of behind-the-border forms of protectionism as well. It's got to the stage where the CEO of General Electric has said, it's time for multinational corporations. Remember, these are the organisations that drove the third age of globalisation. It's time for multinational corporations not to think about global value chains, but about localisation, about locating factories in large markets so that they can avoid large tariffs and simply market to a large and dynamic consumer base. These are worrying trends. I believe that these sorts of figures are also driven by uncertainty. Unlike the two first phases of globalisation, this third phase of globalisation is much less predictable. The first two phases of globalisation were driven by governments, either setting up multilateral agreements or, as Britain did in the first age of globalisation, maintaining the gold standard, or by cutting tariffs, or by constructing infrastructure. The third age of globalisation is private sector driven. And because it's private sector driven, it's very unpredictable, it's very volatile. The private sector will move production facilities suddenly, putting hundreds or even thousands of people out of work. So what has started to really underpin this decline in global trade is a decline in global confidence in the stability of the system, and a decline in the confidence in those multilateral mechanisms that we use to think underpin the stability and the predictability of the system. And so the question is globalisation dying? Are we starting to see the beginnings of a second age of deglobalisation? Thank God it hasn't started with a major world war. But there are real parallels between the Depression and the competitive protectionism and the nationalism and the politics of envy of that period of time and the politics that we see today. And so the question is, what is the answer? How do we avoid a second age of deglobalisation, and how do we move forward to a fourth age of globalisation, one that is more stable, one that is more predictable, one that is kinder to people instead of throwing them out of jobs? Well, unsurprisingly, being a university professor, I think the answer lies in the knowledge sector. It is knowledge that has driven the third age of globalisation, but it has been knowledge, technical knowledge, that has been unmediated by the concomitant growth in governance knowledge, in the understanding of how we humanise the advance of technology, how we humanise the advance of globalisation and the economy. And so this is essentially what groups like this should be doing. Our universities, our alumni, our global knowledge elites, which includes everyone in this room, must be part of conversations about governance corollaries of this. How do human beings get together and redesign the toxic politics that we are starting to observe? And yes, there are hopeful signs. Marine Le Pen did not win the French election. Let's hope that other elections that occur around the world, the German election, let's hope Angela Merkel wins, as I call her, the leader of the free world, wins the German election. These are all hopeful signs. They are hopeful signs that the world has not yet lost its head. But it's important to understand that if we allow the forces of technological change, economic competition, and the privatisation of wealth to drive this age of globalisation, we could find ourselves in a second age of deglobalisation to the impoverishment of everyone. Thank you very much.
We have about 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A. If you have any question, please raise your hand. Any question? Everyone is still chewing the presentation. Is anybody would like to start? Let me start. Effie? Yeah. Oh, yeah, Effie first and then.
Thank Thank you, Michael, for very, very thorough and deep explanation on the globalization. I learned a lot from your speech. But when we talk about your last question, how we push this, the fourth generation of globalization instead of the second deglobalization, then I'm start thinking, because in Indonesia, globalization not always means positive. We understand a lot of negative impacts of globalization on our people, and how that we think that liberal economy not always fit for our society. So in that sense, maybe then people like me will tend to think that we maybe have to find another type of modernization or development rather than just think about the globalization. I don't know what's the name, but kind of consensus between economy and politics and social aspect rather than just emphasize on the economy. That's the thing that can so at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evie. I think that's right. I think in any country you would find real concern about globalization. The word globalization itself is not a fashionable word as it was in the 1990s. People everywhere can think of negative consequences of globalization. But I do think we often, in our worry about globalization, forget about what globalization has enabled. One of the things globalization has enabled is the lifting of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Before China joined the world economy, there were a lot of very poor people in China, and now it's estimated 400 million plus people in China have been lifted out of poverty. So I think you're right, it's important for us to think about what other possible growth strategies there might be. Is there a better way than this form of globalization? But we should also, what I worry about, to put it in a nutshell, is that often when economic processes overshoot, because they're not controlled by political processes, they give rise to a toxic politics that damages everyone. So one of the things that I often think about is, okay, what might a second age of deglobalization look like? The first age saw world wars, the growth of new empires like the Japanese and the Nazi Empire. It saw impoverishment and famines. The second age of globalization might see the growth of large blocs around particularly dominant economies. And so you might see a large bloc, economic bloc, form around the United States. You might see a large economic bloc form around Europe, and a large economic bloc form around China, for example. For me, that's a worrying scenario. Partly because Australia isn't a natural part of any bloc. I wonder whether Indonesia would be a natural part of any bloc. But I think there are other forms of deglobalization happening as well. Of course, one of the underlying factors of globalization is the internet, the free flowing flow of information and ideas and communications across the internet. I worry that there are certain countries that are starting to put up blocks on the freedom of the internet. China is a good example. Russia is another example. Turkey is starting to do that. In Brazil, they've started talking about constructing a national intranet with only very weak links to the internet. For me, that's a much poorer world than the world we live in. I don't need to tell Indonesians about the virtues of Facebook and all of that social media that is available to us in the net. So I think there are other kind of worrying forms of deglobalization out there that really are the result of the rise of a defensive, envious politics that really, to me, suggests that we need to start to put a sensible politics around globalisation, which is, I think, the point you started with, rather than allow this form of politics to gain momentum.
Second question, and we have the third one, but second first.
Oke, I'm Arnold. Kebetulan ada Pak Bud, ada nanti sebagian bahan untuk Pak Bud. Two-thirds of the trade, especially export, coming from China, Japan, South Korea, and then EU, and then the United States. And what happened that in the other part of the world, they are under pressure. That means it will imply to the exporting country. At the end, also will imply back to the other non-China all that country. Now, in the world where everything is liberal, in the world free of control, in the world where people want the freedom, then you can expect it's going to be what do you call it, parental efficiency, whereby the cost, the benefit to us will be the cost to the other, kind like this.
Yeah.
And in Indonesian case, we are in a good time. However, we are limited under our undang-undang buatan Pak Bud, di mana kita nggak bisa lebih dari 3%, Pak. Problemnya adalah dalam ada kesempatan ini, in this particular time for Indonesia, we are under globalization situation, under protectionist, but Indonesia cannot extend because of the limitation of our deficit maximum 3%. Itu aja Pak, terima kasih.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Yes.
What would you expect? What would you expect in the world where the other four, unless China, the other exporting country is under pressure?
Yeah.
And for Indonesia, mumpung ada Pak Bud, if I may, Pak, boleh nggak kita lebih dari 3% defisit? Terima kasih.
So what we've seen for countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, is that they've had a chance to join the global industry economy by making component parts, by becoming parts of the global value chains. And so this has been a big part of the convergence that I was talking about between Asia and Europe. The growth of sectors within emerging Asia of these component part manufacturers. The thing that I think really is worrying about this, of course, is the rise of the robot technology. No one really knows what the rise of robots means for the industrialization and the continuing development of the Asian region. I mean, if I was in China, that would really worry me, because a very large part of Chinese industry is dependent on that sort of labour that is being threatened by the rise of robot labour. And so this, I think, should be keeping the Chinese leadership awake at night. I mean, if you're a large American multinational corporation, the advantage of this sort of factory over a factory in Shenzhen or Guangzhou or somewhere like that is that, unlike humans, these things work all night. They work 24 hours a day. So they bring the unit costs down remarkably. And so one possibility is that economists talk about a U-shaped curve in terms of value add. So very high value add, pre-manufacturing, in design, in the technology that goes into things, very low value add in the manufacturing phase, and then in the post-technology product support phase, again, very high value add services. So that leaves manufacturing economies like those of China in really quite a vulnerable position. And that's one of the big wild cards. We're really not sure what will happen when globalization really takes off.
Thank you. Very interesting presentations. My name is Sigi, very good. We know in the 19th century, we know about the globalization, and then 20th century about regionalization like ASEAN, European Union. And then 21st century it comes with mega regionalisms, the emergence of TPP and RCEP in Southeast Asia. But recently we are facing more on bilaterals, given
Yes.
Trump's more preference on because United States' role in globalization is very high.
Yes.
And then I would like to hear your comments about the mega regionalisms versus the bilateralisms that more recently emerged in the world. And number two, that's broader concepts. And number two, maybe I would like to hear your comment about global threat on the globalizations. It's not about localizations or narrow-minded or inward-looking, but it's more global threat that comes to compete with the globalizations in terms of economies, the global threats of fissions or missions, carriers of security that threatens.
Oh, okay. Thanks. That's a very detailed question. Look, I think what you point to is a very important trend that we've seen. You're exactly right. We had, during that second age, part of the third age of globalization, we had the rise of regionalism, but it was a regionalism that supported globalization. So in this part of the world, we had APEC, but APEC, of course, was open regionalism, and it was entirely designed to support and drive forward the multilateral system. What we've seen since the end of the Uruguay round, however, has been the gradual weakening of the multilateral trading system, an inability to conclude the Doha round, and the rise of compensatory preferential trade agreements. These are trade agreements that make sense bilaterally sometimes. Some are of good quality, some are actually quite poor quality. Many of them are trade diverting, and of course all of them pretty much are detracting from multilateral trade liberalisation. Multilateral trade liberalisation is actually going backwards under these things. So I see the development of these agreements as a very negative thing in global trade, and it underpins not only the politics we were talking about, but also the politics of envy, the politics of defensiveness, but also it reflects a fundamental pessimism across the world in the prospects for multilateral trade liberalisation. It's very hard to find strong political constituencies in any country around the world anymore in favour of unilateral free trade. You know, this was what drove the second age of globalisation. It no longer is there. Certainly not in Australia, certainly not in the United States. I don't think here in Indonesia you have a strong domestic constituency for free trade. And so I think the last thing I would say is that you are now starting to see trade agreements being driven by non-economic factors, particularly strategic competition between great powers. I think the three great powers in this region that are competing using trade agreements are the United States, Japan and China. I think increasingly Japan and China are competing using infrastructure as well as trade agreements, investment decisions. All of these things point to economic decision making across borders that is occurring not because of commercial factors, but because of strategic factors, which is further distorting the way that globalisation works. And I think it's making people increasingly defensive. So one of the things that is getting a lot of attention in Australia is China's One Belt, One Road system. Must be getting a lot of attention here as well. People really wonder what is China's intentions behind this system. Is it entirely benign, or is it about China establishing an economic sphere of influence for itself, in which the Chinese economy dominates other economies around it, and therefore is able to dominate them politically as well? This is a very live debate in Australia. I'd be interested to know if this is happening in this country, Indonesia, as well. But people are really wondering about this, and of course, the United States pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a sign for many in Australia that the United States is giving up and ceding the region to China. These are the sorts of conversations that are happening. They were not the sort of conversations that were occurring 20 years ago, and it's a worrying development.
Thank you. Thanks for the time. It's a bit hard to make my brain work in these 8 hours of fasting day. Let me try to respond to some of the comments. I would like to appreciate the talks, Professor Smith and Professor Wesley, with actually giving us one message that we should work together closely between countries, between people on particular issue that put risk on the global development, on the future of humankind and all of us here. But let me just give one or two comments. One is, it's very interesting to follow the story of Professor Wesley told us about the globalization, the stages and so on. And I think we should learn something from the experience, the lessons of the stages of globalization. I just would like to make one comment that it seems to me, I still think that globalization is the fate of human history. Well, at some point, some stage, it will overshoot. Globalization number one seems to overshot, giving rise to war, because all those who are benefiting from globalization trying to get more, even more, by fighting, getting from the other competitors in globalization. War, and then the second followed by deglobalization. I think I agree with that stage. But that is the result of the overshooting. Now we have the latest one is the technological revolution and so on. And it seems to be overshooting also. Must be some system that try to minimize the effect, the negative effect of overshooting. This is, I think, what we are trying to look at, find out. Overshooting is happening very, very clearly in the area of finance. Globalization not only has given rise to kind of new vulnerability of the global finance and therefore global economy. And this is very serious for many countries, like, but for all countries. May not be for the biggest in the global economy, the global finance. And vulnerability like this, of course, needs to be addressed by working together, by putting general rules with regard to how to manage this enormous amount of global money that can be very destructive whenever it moves so suddenly from one location to the other. In Indonesia, we have also witnessed some negative effects, a positive effect, but also some negative effects, very, very real. In investment, even in trade, I think there must be some way that we should try to minimize the negative effect. And as a result of, I mentioned, I call it overshooting, but actually it's how to reduce the negative risk in all these areas. The key, in my view, Professor Wesley, is both we have to work on two legs. One is strengthening some rules with regard to globalization at the global level. There is a big area that we could work together in finance, in investment, in trade, different. The second is, I think it depends on the individual countries. That is strengthening the governance within every country. Governance, which as you mentioned, this is politics. So I think every country has the task to improve the governance, political governance, economic governance within each country, so that we could, even without waiting for the global rules, we could minimize the negative impact of globalization for the country. But I still think that you just cannot get away from this globalization process. I think you have to just take it as given and try to do your best at the global level and at the national level. My friend is asking for the 3% rule. The main way to reduce the risk is to make your own finance in a good order. And then one of the pillar of domestic finance is fiscal policy. We have witnessed quite a number of occasions in many countries, including in Indonesia, that the cause of crisis is the country does not manage its finance well. They incur debt beyond the limits, and that's the key. Deficit can create debt, and debt can create crisis. So I think 3% is arbitrary, but we just copied at the time when the government submitted that bill to the parliament at the time. 3% seemed to be good at the time because it was adopted by the European Union, and we thought it was good. And 60% of our debt should not exceed 60% of our GDP. Sounds good too. So we put in our law, and I think it's still good. It is still good rule. So if you ask me, my friend. I think it is good. Well, that's governance. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we enjoy very much.
Thank you very much.